What if an entire generation of millennial men were told to play by the rules, work hard, get educated, keep your head down, only to have the rules quietly change right as they stepped onto the playing field? What if millions of young men weren't failing because they were lazy or entitled, but because the doors were deliberately closed to them in the name of equity? Why do so many white millennial men suddenly vanish from media, academia, publishing, tech, and corporate America? And then at the exact same moment, why did podcasting, YouTube, Substack, and alternative media explode? Was DEI really a harmless attempt at fairness, or did it function as an explicit system of exclusion? And what happens to marriage, to family, to mental health, and institutional trust when careers are decided by identity instead of competence? And why does this generational betrayal explain so much of the anger, the alienation, and the political volatility that we're living through right now? Yeah, let's talk about that.
Instead of focusing on winning arguments, we're teaching the basic fundamentals of sales and marketing and how we can use them to win in the world of politics, teaching you how to meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Welcome to the Brian Nichols Show.
Well, hey there, folks. Welcome to today's episode of the Brian Nichols Show. I am, as always, your humble host, joining you from our lovely Cardio Miracle Studios here in sunny Eastern Indiana. The Brian Nichols Show is powered by the best heart health supplement in the world, Cardio Miracle. So if you want to learn how to lower your resting heart rate, lower your blood pressure while improving your pump at the gym, just like I did, stick around. We'll talk about that later in today's episode. Or if you're really curious, go ahead, scan that little QR code over my shoulder, or simply head to cardiomiracle.com/TBNS. Either way, you'll know you're in the right spot when you see a little notice at the top of your home screen saying you're shopping with Brian Nichols, which means you're going to get 15% off your order at checkout. One more time, cardiomiracle.com/TBNS, the best heart health supplement in the world. But let's jump into today's episode, and that is, yes, a conversation that any millennial man, any, frankly, Gen Z man has really experienced. That is 10 years of blatant discrimination. And it's not just anecdotal evidence at this point, it's data. And today we're going to be reading an article from Compact Magazine called The Lost Generation. And then afterwards, I'll be giving my thoughts. First, we're going to jump in and read the article in its entirety because there is just so much good stuff to actually dig through, real data, and it helps tell the story better than I ever could. So with that being said, let's jump right into the article, The Lost Generation. For 15 years, I've scalped tickets to pay for the bills, but in January 2016, I almost managed a real career. I was 31. I'd been in Los Angeles for 5 years writing scripts. There had been minor successes, a couple of small projects optioned, but I'd recently started writing with my best friend. We were writing constantly, making each other better, building momentum. Success felt close, and back then, it always did. We'd written a pilot script that a veteran showrunner had agreed in a very theoretical, very Hollywood sort of way to come on to. That project had fizzled, so we were surprised when an executive emailed us out of the blue to meet. The showrunner explained he submitted us for an upcoming writer's room he was going to run. The exec had loved our pilot and wanted to hire us. This was it. The moment our careers were supposed to take off. We put in our time. I've been tutoring SATs and reselling tickets to make ends meet while I wrote. And 5 years seemed par for the course based on the slightly older guys we knew who'd made it. But of course, by 2016, we were already too late. The showrunner emailed us back apologetically. I had initially thought I might be able to bring you guys on, he wrote, but in the end, it wasn't possible. We met with the executive anyway, a Gen X white guy who told us how much he loved our pilot. But the writer's room was small, he explained apologetically, and the higher level writers were all white men. They couldn't have an all-white male room. Maybe if the show got another season, they'd be able to bring us on. They never did. The doors seemed to close everywhere, all at once. In 2011, the year I moved to Los Angeles, white men were 48% of lower-level TV writers. By 2024, they accounted for just 11.9%. The Atlantic's editorial staff went from 53% male and 89% white in 2013 to 36% male and 66% white in 2024. White men fell from 39% of tenure-track positions in humanities at Harvard in 2014 to 18% in 2023. In retrospect, 2014 was the hinge, the year DEI became institutionalized across American life. In industry after industry, gatekeepers promised extra consideration to everyone who wasn't a white man, and then provided just that. With every announcement of promotions, there was a desire to put extra emphasis on gender or race, a former management consultant recalled. And when you don't fall into those groups, that message gets louder and louder and gains more and more emphasis. On the one hand, you want to celebrate people who have been at a disadvantage. On the other hand, you look and you say, wow, the world is not rooting for you, and in fact, it's deliberately rooting against you. And as the Trump administration takes a chainsaw to diversity, equity, and inclusion apparatus, there's a tendency to portray DEI as a series of well-meaning but ineffectual HR modules. Undoubtedly, there has been a ham-fisted DEI programming that is intrusive or even alienating, explained Kaniga Yamahata Taylor in The New Yorker. But for the most part, it is a relatively benign practice meant to increase diversity while also sending a message that workplaces should be fair and open for everyone. And this may be how Boomer and Gen X white men experience DEI. But for white male millennials, DEI wasn't a gentle rebalancing. It was a profound shift in how power and prestige were distributed. Yet practically none of the thousands of articles and think pieces about diversity have considered the issue by cohort. This isn't a story about all white men. It's a story about white male millennials in professional America, about those who stayed and who, mostly, stayed quiet. The same identity, a decade apart, met entirely different professional fates. If you were 40 in 2014, born in 1974, beginning your career in the late 90s, you were already established. If you were 30 in 2014, you hit the wall. Because the mandates to diversify didn't fall on older white men, who in many cases still wielded enormous power. They landed on us. First, media matters. It may be hard to remember now, but a decade ago, the prevailing critique of American journalism was that it was woefully lacking in gender and racial diversity. There had been hope that new media would be different, that the internet might bring in a wider range of voices. But by the mid-2010s, today is just 35% male and 60% white. Like BuzzFeed, a media operation that had been trying to shake up the way people get their news and entertainment online in 2014 was just 36% male and 50% leadership roles are overwhelmingly made, but nothing explains the new critics were mostly right. Like Gawker was still 57% male and 79% white. Vice was majority male, but nothing explains the new media. At 538, Nate Silver complained about a gender gap so severe that only 50% of applications and whose internal demographics it was captured this world that Andrew arrived in 2015. Back in 2020, he took a job at a prominent new media organization and was put back into general assignment when Ezra Klein came under fire for his startup's lack of diversity. It was rewarding, he told me. But if you imagine working a full-time gig, nights, lack of weekends, diversity, and then on top of that, trying to build up a beat on the side, and that could eventually propel you into something sustainable. The company was just 37% male, but developed and 59% there was white. Still a general optimism in the air, especially around new media. 73% I had a very well-regarded demographic and occasional reshaped. Not only I had credibility as somebody who had come from the more left-leaning perspective as well as source on the left, but was willing to give them a kick in the teeth every now and then. I remember at the time, it felt really about holding power to account about how if somebody breaks into your car or your home after it's white supremacy to journalism, cops, even if you need a non-profit insurance report, ambient talk about diversity always and power structures have been part of the general atmosphere, and he never much thought about it with regret. In any progressive space, there was always at least some concern about that with a lot of regret. I did not see it in any center-left impeding my advancement for the first 6 or 7 years of my career. But now they're incredibly left places. In 2019, I imagine one reason newsrooms have gotten more explicitly lefty New York is that you have white guys and white women adopting a kind of protective coloration, another white allyship mindset to get you through the door. I understand that reaction for his part of me was unable to adopt the performative allyship that had become the needle on diversity hiring. I always thought I was an effeminate nerd growing up, but my way of expressing myself now puts me on the most masculine end of men in media, he told me. New York, I started to pick up on the fact that there wasn't much room for people who he'd been there for 5 years. In my team reporter who couldn't seem to move up and suddenly recruited for a senior reporter position and a more diversity outlet. Judgment was, as he put it, obsessive about recruiting people of color. But the pool was small, and anyone like a cruel joke, extensive interviews, writing tests, or cable news, endless meeting with all the declarations these newsrooms have been making. The imperative that the job enough white guys already seemed to be the mantra. He told me, a gay man of color couldn't help but wonder if
to go
that meant you were being passed up for opportunities
to senior
even
reporter
in your own
in less
organization.
than 2
Institutions pursuing diversity
If you're a white man,
decided
you
that
gotta
there
be
would
the
be no
superstar,
backsliding.
Andrew told me.
If a
It
position
can't help
was
feeling
vacated
like
by a
no
woman
matter
or
how
a person
good
of
you are,
color, the
you were
expectation
born
was
in
it
the
would be
wrong
filled
year.
by another woman or
As he
person of
saw
color.
the industry
The
had
hope
its
was
super
always that
successful
you were
white
going to
guys who
hire
made
a
it
diverse
before
candidate, a
2014,
senior hiring
and
editor
were so
at a major
functionally
outlet
Gen
told
X,
me,
but for everyone
if
else,
there was a black
moving
woman
up
at
in
the beginning
the
of her
contracting
career you
industry
wanted to
was
hire,
merely-
you could find someone. But if she was any good, you knew she would get accelerated to the New York Times
As
or
he
the
saw, the
Washington Post
industry
in
had
short
had its
order.
super
And the
successful-
truth is, after years of concerted effort, most news outlets had already reached the quietly surpassed
As he
general
saw, the
parity.
industry
by
had its
2019,
super
the
successful
newsrooms
white
of
guys who'd made it
ProPublica,
before
the Washington
2014,
Post, the New York
and
Times
so
were
were
majority
functionally Gen
female,
X,
as
but
were
for
new media
everyone
upstarts
else,
Vice,
moving up in a
Vox,
contracting
BuzzFeed,
industry
and the
was
Huffington
nearly
Post.
impossible.
And then
I was
2020
kind of
happened,
grandfathered
and
in
the
during
wheels
one
came
area,
off.
and it-
In the aftermath of George Floyd's death,
I was
newsrooms
kind of
tripped
grandfathered in
over themselves
during one
to stage
area and
a
had achieved a
reckoning.
level
The
going
New York
into
Times
2015,
solemnly praised
2024,
sweeping
where
reforms.
it just didn't
On top
really
of the
affect
sweeping
me, was
reforms, it
one of
already
those
promised.
superstar-
The Washington Post declared it
One of
become
these
the most
superstar
diverse
journalists
and
told me.
inclusive newsroom in the
And
country.
after surviving
CNN pledged a
years of buyouts,
sustained
Andrew
commitment to
finally
race
made
coverage, while
senior
Bon Appetit
reporter in
confessed that our
2023,
mastheads
but
have
by
been
then it
far
felt
too
like
white, far
less
too
a
long,
recognition
and
than a
that the magazine
consolation
had
prize.
tokenized many
He was coming
BIPOC
up on
staffers
40,
and contributors.
unmarried, with little
NPR went
room
further,
or-
still declaring that diversity was nothing less than its North Star.
He was
These
coming up on
weren't empty
40,
slogans
unmarried,
either. In
with little
2021,
room for
new
further
hires,
lateral movement.
Condé Nast
And
were just
when the
25%
next round of
male and
buyouts hit, he
49%
decided
white.
it was
At the
time to
California Times, parent company of the Los Angeles Times and the San Diego Union Tribune, they were just 39% male and 31% white. That year, ProPublica hired 66% women and 58% people of color, and at NPR, 78% of new hires were people of color. For a typical job, we get a couple hundred applications, and probably at least 80 from white guys, the hiring editor recalled. It was a given that we weren't going to hire the best person. It was jarring how we could talk about excluding white guys. The pipeline hadn't changed much. White men were still nearly half the applicants, but they were now filling closer to 10% of open positions. Suddenly, in Andrew's newsroom, everything was driven by identity. There were endless diversity tradings, a racial climate assessment. At one point, reporters were told they had to catalog in minute detail the identity characteristics of all their sources. Andrew had been instrumental in forming the union at his company, and he objected when negotiations shifted from severance pay and parental leave to demands for racial quotas. They wanted to do like emergency hires of black people, he said. When we questioned these new priorities, the response was swift. On a Zoom call, women would clap back at something I was saying, and other women would snap their fingers in the chat window, he recalled. It was this whole subcultural language being introduced wholesale. Desperate for advancement, he had the same job, the same title for nearly 6 years. Andrew looked elsewhere. I applied for positions at the Atlantic, Politico, CNN, the Washington Post, 3 different desks at the New York Times, he told me, but newsrooms were contracting, which only made the competition more intense. When scarcity sets in, you start to worry about these things a little bit more, Andrew reflected. This was a business model problem that was exacerbated by the racial and gender preference problem. At the Atlantic, Andrew didn't even get an interview. Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief, had described his hiring philosophy back in 2019, quote, by opening up the possibilities of younger people, women, and people of color, by imagining their rise in a deliberate way, I've just widened the pool of potential leadership. There's no quota system here. Goldberg was candid about another less comfortable reality. It's really, really hard to write a 10,000-word cover story. He said in that same interview, there's not a lot of journalists in America who can do it. The journalists in America who do it are almost exclusively white males. With or without quotas, the Atlantic succeeded in hiring fewer of these white males. Since 2020, nearly 2/3 of the Atlantic's hires have been women, along with nearly 50% of people of color. In 2024, the Atlantic announced that 3/4 of editorial hires in the past year had been women and 69% people of color. The irony was, where older white men remain in charge, especially where they remain in charge, there was almost no room to move up. Quote, if you hired a team of white guys around you, you were putting a target on your back, recalled the hiring editor. At the New York Times Magazine, one of the few prestige magazines with a public masthead, Jake Silverstein, a Gen X white man, serves as editor-in-chief, and Bill Wasik, another Gen X white man, serves as editorial director. But of 9 millennial senior editors and story editors below them, there's just one white guy, and he's been there since 2012, effectively grandfathered in. At the very bottom of the ladder, the picture is a little different. Since 2020, only 7.7% of Los Angeles Times interns have been white men. Between 2018 and 2024, Of the roughly 30 summer interns each year at the Washington Post, just 2 or 3 white men. In 2025, coincident with certain political shifts, the Post intern class had 7 white guys, numbers not seen since way back in 2014. In 2018, the New York Times replaced its summer internship with a year-long fellowship. Just 10% of its nearly 220 fellows have been white men. Other pipelines have dried up as well. The alt weeklies that gave misfit young men their start have shed them entirely. There are no white men on the editorial staff of the Seattle Stranger or on the staff of the Indy Week. As of late 2017, there were 6 white men at the masthead of the Portland Mercury, and by 2024, there was just one, the boomer editor-in-chief. By the early 2020s, many journalists I spoke to noticed something else. The young white men who once flooded internship and fellowship pools had simply stopped applying. Gen Z men had absorbed the message that journalism just wasn't for them. The femaleness is striking. A well-known Gen X reporter with impeccable liberal bona fides confided, "It's like, wow, where have the guys gone?" In less than a decade, the entire face of the industry changed. The New York Times newsroom had gone from 57% male and 78% white in 2015 to 46% male and 66% white in 2024. Condé Nast today is just 35% male and 60% white. BuzzFeed, a media corporation that had been 52% male and 75% white in 2014, was just 36% male and 52% white by 2023. But nothing explains the new media story quite like Vox, whose explainers dominated 2010's discourse and whose internal demographics capture the decade's professional shift. Back in 2013, when Ezra Klein came under fire for his startup's lack of diversity, Vox Media was 82% male and 88% white. By 2022, the company was just 37% male and 59% white. And by 2025, leadership was 73% female. The demographic shift reshaped not only who told the stories, but which stories got told. After George Floyd's death, Andrew's colleague Lucas was assigned a piece about why you should never call the police. I remember how having to interview one of these abolitionists for a story about how if somebody breaks into your car or home, it's white supremacy to call the cops, even if you need it for an insurance report, Lucas told me. That always made me feel gross. I think back on that with a lot of regret. Newsrooms were center-left places in 2005, the prominent Gen X reporter told me, but now they're incredibly lefty places. I imagine one reason newsrooms have gotten more explicitly lefty is that you have white guys and white women adopting a kind of protective coloration, allyship mindset to get through the door. Andrew, for his part, was unable to adopt the performative allyship that had become expected. I always thought I was an effeminate nerd growing up, but my way of expressing myself now puts me on the most masculine end in men in media, he told me. I started to pick up on the fact that there wasn't much room for people who even speak in my timbre. He was recruited for a senior reporter position at a more prestigious outlet, jumping through hoops every step of the way, as he told me. But by the end of it, it felt like a cruel joke. Extensive interviews, writing tests, endless meetings with various editors, only to find out months later that the job had gone to someone a decade younger than him. A gay man of color who managed to go from intern to assistant editor to senior reporter in less than 2 years. If you're a white man, you gotta be a superstar, Andrew told me. And you can't help feeling like no matter how good you are, you were born in the wrong year. And he saw it. The industry had its super successful white guys who'd made it before 2014, and so were functionally Gen X. But for everyone else moving up in the contracting industry, moving up in a contracting industry was nearly impossible. I was kind of grandfathered in during one era and had achieved a level going into 2015, 2024, where it just didn't really affect me, one of the superstar journalists told me. After surviving years of buyouts, Andrew finally made senior reporter in 2023. But by then, it felt less like recognition and more like a consolation prize. He was coming up on 40, unmarried with little room for forward or lateral movement. When the next round of buyouts hit, he decided it was time to leave. 2. The Ivory Tower. There are many stories we tell ourselves about race and gender, especially in academia, but the one thing everyone I spoke to seemed to agree on is it's best not to talk about it, at least not in public, at least not with your name attached. The humanities are so small, a millennial professor nervously explained. There's a difference between thinking something and making common knowledge that you think it, said another. So it came as a bit of a shock when David Austin Walsh, a Yale postdoc and left-wing Twitter personality, decided to detonate any chance he had at a career with a single tweet. I'm 35 years old. I'm 4+ years post-PhD, and quite frankly, I'm also a white dude, he wrote on X. Combine those factors together, and I'm, for all intents and purposes, unemployable as a 20th century American historian. The pile-on was swift and vicious. You are all just laughable, wrote the New York Times' Nicole Hannah-Jones. Have you seen the data on professorships? White males are 30% of the U.S. population, but nearly 40% of the faculty, tweeted a tenured professor at GWU. All right, it's the holidays, which means we're all doing that annual dance, pretending that we love this time of year while secretly we're running on stress, sugar, and whatever's left of our sanity. You've got the office parties, the family gatherings, the flights, the long lines, the weird cookie that Aunt Carol made, and on top of that, the weather's colder, you're eating heavier, you're sleeping less, and your immune system is basically sending you texts saying like, hey buddy, I'm not okay. And let's be real, December has a way of exposing everything your body has already been struggling with. Low energy, amplified. Brain fog, doubled. Circulation, frozen like your car windshield. And don't even get me started on inflammation after you've had your 5th helping of just a little more at dinner. See, that's where Cardio Miracle comes in. It gives your body that one thing the holidays steal the most, nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is actually what helps the blood flow. It helps oxygen reach your cells, support your immune system, and helps your body bounce back from the stress, the sugar, the travel, the cold weather, all of it. And I've been drinking it every day, morning and night, because I don't have time to crash halfway through the month. And Cardio Miracle keeps me steady, clear-headed, energized, and able to actually enjoy the holidays instead of just survive them. So if you want to give yourself the gift of not feeling like you're worn out at Christmas, just go ahead and scan the QR code over my shoulder, click that little link in the show notes, or visit cardiomiracle.com/TBNS to grab yours. And by the way, you'll get 15% off at checkout. And now, let's get back to the show. Hard to make a case for systemic discrimination. It didn't matter that as far back as 2012, women were more likely to be tenure track across the humanities than men, or that a 2015 peer-reviewed study suggested that STEM hiring favored women, or even that CUPAHR, an association of academic DEI professionals, found that, quote, assistant professors of color, 35%, and female assistant professors, 52%, are overrepresented in comparison to U.S. doctoral degree recipients, 32% and 44%, respectively. As in other industries, what mattered were the optics. When people looked at academia, what they still saw was old white men. Lots of them. A big part of why it's hard to diversify is the turnover is really slow, a tenured Millennial professor explained. And that's become worse now because boomers live a long time. Many elite universities once had mandatory retirement at 70, but in 1994, Congress sunsetted the academic exemption for age discrimination, locking in the demographics of the largely white male professorate for a generation. White men may still be 55% of Harvard's arts and sciences faculty, down from 63% a decade ago, but this is a legacy of boomer and Gen X employment patterns. For tenure track positions, the pipeline for future faculty, white men have gone from 49% in 2014 to 27% in 2024. In the humanities, they've gone from 39% to 21%. See, the pipeline and the cohorts haven't changed much. Newly minted humanities PhDs have been evenly split between men and women for a decade now, and white men outnumber other groups in most applicant pools. But who was getting hired certainly did. At Berkeley, white men were 48.2% of faculty applicants in the physical sciences, but just 26% of hires for assistant professor positions. In 2018, only 14.6% of tenure-track assistant professors hired at Yale had been white American men. In the humanities, that number was just 6 out of 76, 7.9%. The white men who do get hired are often older and more established or foreign. Several people I spoke with noticed that European white men don't seem to face these barriers. The reason, one professor suggested, is they exist slightly outside the American culture wars. Another is an administrative sleight of hand. Federal education statistics, IPEDS, classify foreign nationals outside racial categories. In other words, a white European on a work visa doesn't register as white in diversity metrics. Among new PhDs with definite academic employment plans, white temporary visa holders are nearly twice as likely as white U.S. citizens or permanent residents to secure tenure-track positions, 61% versus 33.1% in 2023. Senior hiring still is very often white men. Will, an Ivy League professor, told me. His humanities department had hired 2 higher-level white men, then conducted a search for a junior professor. There was one white man among the finalists. On paper, he was so clearly the strongest candidate, Will remembered. It really kind of did feel like, well, we can't not interview this guy, but we're still not going to hire him. He had been told, if we're on the fence here, we should not go with the man again. Yale's history department, with 10 white male professors over the age of 70, provides us a striking illustration of the generational divide in hiring. Since 2018, they've hired 4 older white men as full professors, but among 16 tenured or tenure-track millennials, just 1 is a white man. At 84, the Cold War historian John Gaddis isn't even the oldest in the department. The Yale history department at the time I arrived in 1997 was overwhelmingly white and male, if not yet millennial, he told me in an email. Some remedial action was long overdue. This remedial action can take many forms. Berkeley commissioned regression analyses to identify which quasi-legal strategies could produce the fewest number of white male job offers. And at Dartmouth, the Mellon-to postdoc program provided 10 tenure-track positions for new hires with a demonstrated commitment to addressing racial underrepresentation in their disciplines. None of them were white men. Cluster hiring, which began in the 90s as a way to expand interdisciplinary research, was transformed in the 2010s as a shortcut to achieve diversity goals. Entire groups of underrepresented candidates could now be hired at once, working around the often Byzantine tenure approval process. The way you try to demographically diversify without making it explicit is searching in areas where the areas are strongly correlated with gender or ethnicity, an Ivy League professor explained to me. A cluster hire in Latinx studies will gain you several Latinx faculty. A professor of transgender studies will, in all likelihood, not be a straight cis man, and a white male assistant professor of black sexualities is closer to an SNL sketch than any lived reality in 2024. All this left little oxygen for anyone else. James spent nearly a decade first at Yale Law, then at a top classics program, watching his professional pathway narrow until it seemingly disappeared. He saw people he knew, as long as they fit the right demographic profile, bypass open searches and receive tenure-track offers before they even finished their PhDs. My own advisors would say very openly, they're just 2 completely different hiring schemes, he told me. They're just 2 completely different categories of person. Hanging over it all was the invisible curriculum, the political assumptions about what should or should not be studied. James recalled a fellow graduate student he met at Yale, a white man oblivious to the latest academic orthodoxies. He went on this long, passionate monologue about military history. He knew all sorts of details on Roman military history, and he really wanted to study it. And I just thought, you are hopeless. There is no way anyone's going to hire you. He almost wasn't schooled properly. If he had been, without anyone ever needing to tell him, he would just drop all that about military history because he'd know that's white and European and male and dead. Only one person from James's classic cohort wound up with a tenure-track offer. He's gay, Asian American, exceptionally conservative in the language of critical theory, James said, and he's got his job on the merits. He's extremely good, but he's into stuff that's also very in. James, on the other hand, applied to just a couple of tenure-track jobs in classics before he gave up. Most people didn't even try, he told me. For young white men doing dead white male stuff, it was just totally hopeless. I operated under completely false assumptions, Ethan, an Ivy League educated social scientist, told me. He'd always had the vague and naive and frankly privileged idea that professionally everything would work itself out. I was going to be a tenure-track professor, he said. That was my expectation. Like so many middle-class millennials in the Obama era, Ethan believed he was on the right side of history. He had entered academia after an unsatisfying stint in the corporate world precisely because he was interested in issues of inequality. He wanted to make the world a better place. I came in wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, and I felt like in the early 2010s, there was a good reason to feel that way, he told me. Society was moving in a direction that felt more fairer, less caste-oriented. After Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, and then Me Too, as talk of diversity and representation and privilege swept across campuses, universities responded with a host of new initiatives. While faculty diversity programs had been in place for decades, Penn and Columbia committed tens of millions of dollars to address the issue in 2012, Harvard in 2006, and Yale had launched efforts as early as 1999. These had been mostly ineffective. This time would be different. The new initiatives may have had ethereal, non-specific names like inclusive excellence and toward new destinations, but they had very concrete goals. Things changed really quickly, Ethan said. I think I was just a couple of years off in terms of what the opportunities looked like. In his first year of the academic job market, Ethan applied to nearly 50 jobs. It was a slog. He was thrilled when he was a finalist for a tenure track position at Brown University. He was flown out to Providence, where he toured the campus and he met with faculty, but Brown, like much of the academic world, had other institutional priorities. Back in 2016, Brown had pledged to double faculty diversity within 6 years. There is significant work to do in the coming months and years to implement diversity and inclusion action plan, Provost Richard Locke, himself a white male boomer, said at the time. A diversity representative was installed on every job search committee. The Office of Institutional Equity and Diversity reviewed all hiring advertisements as well as faculty short and long lists. In tenure track hiring, the long list is a collection of potential candidates and the short list is a selection of the most qualified to consider for the interview phase. To give a sense of what this meant on the ground, in 2022, there were 728 applicants to tenure track jobs in the humanities at Brown. 55% of them were men. At every stage of the process, the male share was whittled down. The long list was 48% male, the short list 42%. Only 34% of candidates who made it to the interview round were male, and only 29% of the jobs were ultimately offered to men. A similar dynamic played out in the social sciences. 54% of the 722 applicants were men, 44% of the shortlist was male, and just 32% of job offers were tendered to men. In the physical sciences, women were 23% of applicants, but received 42% of the job offers. Ethan made it to the final interview round at Brown. After a long back and forth with the search committee, a sign he believes of internal dissension, he lost out. They wanted everything through the prism of race, Ethan recalled. Unless you place race squarely at the center of your research, you're vulnerable, especially if your identity doesn't fit the desired profile. Of the men who managed to pass through Brown's gender gauntlet, almost none were white. Since 2022, Brown has hired 45 tenure track professors in the humanities and social sciences. Just 3 were white American men, 6.7%. Over the next 3 years, Ethan applied to dozens more positions, including UC Berkeley and UC Irvine. As elsewhere, the UC schools required DEI statements in which the prospective faculty were asked to detail future plans to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ethan had to write dozens of these statements in the course of his job search, but the UCs take it a step further. Under an $8.5 million state program called Advancing Faculty Diversity, UC administrators use DEI statements as a first cut to winnow down applicant pools before faculty even allowed to consider other candidates. Ethan didn't make any UC shortlists, but why would he have? The program had achieved its intended effect. At Berkeley, as recently as 2015, white male hires were 52.7% of new tenure track faculty. In 2023, they were 21.5%. UC Irvine had hired 64 tenure track assistant professors in the humanities and social sciences since 2020. Just 3, 4.7%, are white men. Of the 59 assistant professors in the arts, humanities, and social sciences appointed at UC Santa Cruz between 2020 and 2024, only 2 were white men, 3%. All in all, Ethan was a finalist for a tenure track position 5 times. He was flown out again and again for interviews and meet and greets and departmental dinners, always the bridesmaid, but never the bride. At a certain point, he began to see himself the way the search committees did. Other identifiers or other things I valued about myself have receded, he explained. Being a white man, meanwhile, moved into the foreground in a way that I didn't expect. It's taken a toll on Ethan's personal life. He's been with his partner for 7 years, but they've spent much of the time treading water. They want kids, but without the financial security of a tenure track position, it's daunting. The decision is on hold and may never happen, he said. He's always anxious the grant money might dry up. I don't feel like my career path is leading anywhere. It feels like a dead end. Occasionally, he surrenders to anger and bitterness. There's a huge group of talented white men who can't get tenure track jobs, he told me. For a set of institutions so obsessed with bias, they're completely blind to their own. As for Richard Locke, the prof who spearheaded Brown's diversity and inclusion action plan, well, in 2022, Locke left to accept a Siniker, a dean of Apple University, Apple's in-house personal training facility. In all searches, there has been a consistent attention to diversity and inclusion, he bragged in the validatory interview. His replacement at Brown was, who else? Another 60-year-old white man. 3. Peak TV. Matt is the sort of smart, slightly manic cinephile who's been a fixture of Hollywood forever. The guy at the bar who can explain why a project was greenlit, a buyer with lots of money and little experience, or why a director got hired, background as a playwright, and it was a Scott Rudin, and dismissed the latest Netflix release with a wave of his hand. Dog shit, a story that shouldn't be a movie. Like me, Matt moved out to Los Angeles in 2011, but unlike me, by 2014, he landed a job as a staff writer on a network TV series. I thought I would be one of those MediaCorp white jabronis who just floats to the top and works forever, he said. He earned more money from that single episode of network TV than he'd seen in his life. He felt he was on a familiar trajectory. Write some specs, network ground, get your break, and then work steadily until you get your own show. But he couldn't outrun the culture. In the fall of 2014, the Oscars nominated only white people for acting awards, and hashtag Oscars So White was born. The New York Times ran story after story. The Academy promised reform, as did the studios, and they delivered. In 2015, Matt was looking for a follow-up job as a staff writer or story editor. I could crack anything, he recalled. It was like almost immediate. There was a real disillusionment because I thought it was just kind of me for a while. It wasn't. Hollywood was in the midst of a revolution. As hashtag Oscars So White bled into hashtag Me Too, the mandates only intensified. You could read a white guy's script, a former assistant to a Gen X white male showrunner told me, but there was no way in hell that person was going to get staffed on the show. Showrunners only had a couple of spots for white people, and they kept those for 40 or 50-year-old white guys they'd known for years. A whistleblower sent me a document from early 2017, an internal needs sheet compiled by a major talent agency that shows just how steep the headwinds were. Across the grid, which tracks staffing needs for TV writer rooms, the same shorthand appears dozens of times. Diverse, female, women, and diverse only. These mandates came from some of the most profile names in television. Noah Hawley, prioritizing women. Dean Devlin, prioritizing women, ideally higher ethnic, African American. Ryan Murphy, want female and diverse, emphasis on African American. This was systemic discrimination documented in writing, implemented without consequence. It's striking how casual it all was. Chicago Fire, the UL upper level, can be anyone, but we need diverse SW staff writers. As in other industries, upper level positions, writers with experience and credits, could still be filled by white men, but the entry level jobs, the staff writer and co-producer positions that Matt and thousands of other aspiring writers were actually competing for, were reserved for others. The studios had these quotas they felt pressure to fill, a veteran talent manager told me. It was always the lower and mid-level people. Every fellowship grant and hiring incentive was suddenly oriented toward changing who got in the door. The Writers Guild lists more than a dozen studio-run initiatives for emerging diverse writers. The Disney Writing Program, which prides itself on placing nearly all of its fellows as staff writers, had awarded 107 writing fellowships and 17 directing fellowships over the past decade. None to white men. Nearly every capsule bio for these programs is an attempt to communicate that the writer is not a white man. A Korean and Polish American writer from Seattle, a comedy writer with Cuban, Puerto Rican, and New Mexican roots. Another prestigious venue for up-and-coming screenwriters, Another prestigious venue for up-and-coming screenwriters was the Sundance Screenwriters Lab, which proudly lists Darren Aronofsky, Paul Thomas Anderson, and Quentin Tarantino among its alumni. The lab was just amazing, Quentin Tarantino recalled in 2017 at the 25th anniversary of Reservoir Dogs. They took us really seriously. I couldn't believe how altruistic it was. Their whole point was to just help us, to refine our aesthetic. In the 2010s, Sundance came under fire for producing a disproportionate number of white male amateurs. The organizations decided that it would never happen again. In 2016 and 2017, 27.5% of applicants to the Screenwriters Lab were white men, but they were just 14.7% of the participants. That figure turned out to be relatively high. Since 2018, just 8 of 138, or 5.8% of the fellows selected, had been white men. Notably, nearly all either had some other defining characteristics, disabled, gay, or were partnered with a woman or person of color. And today, just 1 in 10 millennial programmers at Sundance is a straight white man. These programs, originally established to open closed pipeline, turned into their own exclusionary infrastructure. Matt never bothered applying. At a certain point, you realize the juice isn't worth the squeeze, he said. You're doing everything you can to break through, and the goalposts keep moving. After striking out in TV for almost 5 years, Matt transitioned into features, which were less identity-driven. I thought not working for that many years would break me, but it actually made me better, he told me. I had to figure out how to write stuff that would pop and get me back in. When we spoke, it was a real point of pride of how much I'd been able to improve his writing, how at least temporarily he'd succeeded in overcoming the odds. By the end of the 2010s, that work paid off. One of his scripts landed on the Blacklist, a prestigious annual ranking of unproduced screenplays voted on by Hollywood developmental executives. This gave Matt much needed momentum. He sold multiple spec scripts and was finally able to quit his day job, but it was hard to translate into steady work. Even after he managed to get A-list showrunners attached to a couple of projects, when staffing season came, they never offered him a position on their own shows. Hiring me was never even in the conversation, he said. In other words, Matt had a better chance of getting his own show on the air than of getting staffed. Dan Erickson, the creator of Severance, who sold his pilot in 2016, wasn't able to land a job in the TV's writer's room until his own show began production. In 2021, Matt's agent submitted him for a prestige series. The showrunners liked his examples. They wanted to talk to him about availability, but the offer was abruptly pulled. One of the showrunners, a Gen X white guy, had blocked it. The room already had too many white guys. You're crawling through broken glass and it's not enough, Matt reflected. I kind of just chose to ignore it out of self-preservation because if I'm bitter and angry, then I'm even further away from what I want. And nobody wants the guy shaking his fist. Through our conversations, Matt never blamed the women or people of color who had gotten opportunities that he hadn't. He blamed the older generation of white men who pulled up the ladder behind them. And he was right too. Between 2004 and 2013, over 40 Gen X white men received Academy Award nominations for screenwriting. In the following decade, from 2014 to 2023, more than 50 Gen X white men were nominated, alongside just 6 white male millennials. Over Matt's 14 years in Hollywood, the changes had been staggering. In 2011, when he and I moved to California, white men were a staggering 60% of TV writers. By 2025, according to the WGA's own diversity statistics, they accounted for just 11.9% of lower-level writers. Women of color made up 34.6%. White men directed 69% of TV episodes in 2014 and just 34% in 2021. But that remaining third went overwhelmingly to established names, leaving little space for younger white men. Since 2021, 11 directors under 40 have been nominated for Emmys. None have been white men. I saw the graveyard of people not too dissimilar from me, Peter, the assistant to the Gen X showrunner, told me. Peter, who graduated from a top 5 college in the early 2010s, watched as slightly older millennial men wait for the break that never came. They were like, hey, I'm going to take this kind of shit job for 2 years. Oh, wait, I can do it for 3 more years. And then suddenly they're married, having kids. They just didn't get the deal. It was never going to happen for them. Ever. Peter eventually left for the tech world. It's a lot better to actually know you're about to get hit by a car than to not know, he told me. The tragedy of our generation is just thinking the world is a certain way and all. That single episode of network television from 2014 remains Matt's only produced credit. When we last spoke, he was commuting to his menial day job, newly single, with tens of thousands of dollars of credit card debt. He has recurring fantasies of changing his name and moving to Thailand to escape his creditors. Sweet one bedroom, VPN to access American TV and film content. He texted me, the dream. Number 4, everywhere else. For a decade, it kept going faster and faster. Without any actual quotas to achieve, only the constant exhortation to do better, the diversity complex became self-radicalizing, a strange confluence of top-down and bottom-up pressure. No one ever said what the right number of white men would be, but it was always fewer than you currently had. The boundaries shifted depending on the industry and the moment. A white woman might be favored in some contexts, disfavored in others. An Asian American man might face extra obstacles in tech or medicine, but if he wanted to be a screenwriter or an English professor, the system worked in his favor. But for younger white men, any professional success was fundamentally a problem for institutions to solve. And solve it, they did. Over the course of the 2010s, nearly every mechanism liberal America used to confer prestige has reweighted along identitarian lines. 7 white male Gen Xers won the MacArthur Genius Fellowship in 2013 alone, the same as the total number of white male millennials who's won since. In 2014, 2 white male millennials were National Book Award finalists, including 1 winner. That year, 9 white males, American artists under 40, appeared at the Whitney Biennial. But for the 70 millennial writers nominated for the National Book Awards in the decade that followed, just 3 were white men. The big 4 galleries represent 47 millennial artists, just 3 are white men. And at the 2024 Whitney Biennial, which featured 45 millennial artists, 0 were white American men. The white men shut out of the culture industries didn't surge into other high-status fields. They didn't suddenly flood advertising, law, or medicine, which are all less white and significantly less male than they were a decade ago. White men dropped from 31.2% of law school matriculants in 2016 to 25.7% in 2024. The shift in medicine has been even more dramatic. In 2014, white men were 31% of American medical students. By 2025, they were just 20.5%, a 10 percentage drop in barely over a decade. At every step, there's some form of selection, a millennial oncologist told me. Medical school admissions, residency programs, chief resident positions, fellowships, each stage tilts away from white men or white adjacent men. The white guy is now the token. Nor was tech much refuge. At Google, white men went from nearly half the workforce in 2014 to less than a third by 2024, a 34% decline. In 2014, at Amazon, entry-level professionals, college graduates just starting out, were 42.3% white male. These were the employees who, if they had advanced normally over the next decade, would be the mid-level managers today. But mid-level Amazon managers fell from 55.8% white male in 2014 to just 33.8% in 2024, a decline of nearly 40%. The pipeline was never 50-50, a former management consultant explained. The elite business schools remained around 60% male and predominantly white throughout the 2010s, but we were hiring as if it were 50-50 anyways. For a lot of the guys in their mid-30s around 2017, 2018, it was quite a dramatic shift. One tech giant journalist told me, they're all like, whoa, suddenly every door is closed and I'm just not going to move ahead with this company at all. Because it's been lightly and sometimes not so lightly communicated to me that there's just no way the job I want is going to be given to a white guy. A whole generation found their path was blocked. The refuges that young white men did find, crypto, podcasting, Substack, were refuges precisely because institutional barriers to entry didn't exist. A friend who is now an executive at a major crypto company scraped by as a freelance film editor for years. He applied to Netflix 5 times. Eventually, he was told explicitly that they didn't need more white guys. He didn't go into crypto because it was high status. Hollywood, the high status industry, wouldn't have him. The DEI departments have mostly shut down or quietly rebranded. The mountains of reports, the glossy PDFs have been quietly scrubbed as if to hide the evidence. What was the justification for gutting the American meritocracy? No one seems to know. It's tempting to wave it all as secular decline, white men abandoning fields that were losing status or economic value, but the timing doesn't line up. The sharpest declines in opportunity for younger white men didn't happen during the rolling crises or of the past few years. They were baked in during the mid-2010s when new media was expanding coverage, universities were growing, and Hollywood was at peak TV. Which raises some uncomfortable questions. Is the media more trusted than it was a decade ago? Is Hollywood making better films and television? Is academia more respected? Have these institutions become stronger since they systematically excluded an entire cohort, or did abandoning meritocracy accelerate their decline? The fact that other groups in other areas have faced worse discrimination, that in the grand scheme of things, the disenfranchisement of white male millennials was relatively mild, is not itself an argument. Especially when an entire liberal establishment insists that nothing actually happened, that the mild correction was in fact no correction at all, and that any white man harmed in the process was in fact mediocre. Because what they're really saying is, we weren't supposed to notice. Over the past 2 years, I've spoken to dozens of white male millennials, evacuating hopes and dreams, disappointments, and resentments. To a man, they insisted on anonymity. There were frenzied pre-publication negotiations over what personal details I would include, back and forths over words and phrases, requests to change pseudonyms to sound even less like real names. Standing behind it was fear that they would end up being that guy. Even the successful white men I spoke to understood that something had fundamentally changed. They expressed gratitude and relief, a recognition that success was contingent, easily disrupted by circumstances way beyond their control. There was such fragility to things going well in the first place, one tenured professor told me, that it's natural to think a slight perturbation would have meant things went worse. Most of the men I interviewed started out as liberals. Some still are, but to feel the weight of society's disfavor can be disorienting. We millennials were true believers in race and gender blind meritocracy, which, for all its faults, is naivete about human nature. Its optimism in the American dream was far superior to what replaced it. And to see the vision so spectacularly betrayed has endangered a skepticism toward an entire liberal project that soon won't disappear. What troubles me is that a lot of thriving white millennial men have had to follow the path of Josh Hawley, where you have to leave liberal America. An old friend, a father of 2 biracial children, told me. I don't want to do that. Liberal America is my home, but if everyone says this is not the place for you, what are you supposed to do? Part 5, back in the room. Back in that office early in 2016, after the executive had explained why he couldn't hire us, the meeting continued like any other. We talked about what we were working on. He told us about his company's upcoming slate, about some Shanghai detective show, an adaptation of a novel about an early Dutch settlement in New Amsterdam. Like most Hollywood meetings, we concluded by promising to find a way to work together soon. And then, as we were leaving, the exec asked if we wanted to go down to the writer's room and say hello to the showrunner. The room was modest as far as these things go. A big whiteboard, a long table, people snacking in the back. The showrunner introduced us to the show's creator, and they immediately returned to the debate they had been having before we arrived. Whether 2 people who take 2 different time machines from 2 different points in the past into the same fixed moment in the future could then switch time machines upon their return. Were there any hidden paradoxes involved? What were the implications? We gave our feeble input. The rest of the staff slouched silently in the back, 3 comfortable Hollywood lifers in their 40s and 50s, white guys with IMDb bios from an alternate universe. His writing career began on the CBS crime series Martial Law, after which he served as a writer and producer on several series through the late 1990s until the early 2000s, including Freaky Links, Roswell, John Doe, Boston Public, LAX, and Smallville. In 2005, he joined the writing staff of the medical mystery series House, along with the 2 younger women who'd gotten the jobs we've been up for. Eventually, the time machine conundrum unresolved, we said our goodbyes. There would be other screenplays, other projects, visits to studio lots, and major pitches, but that was the last time either of us saw the inside of a writer's room. That was the moment we came closest to a career. Had the political environment been different, one job may have led to another, and today I might have colleagues, work friends, a whole range of professional and personal experiences, an entirely different life. At the time, I blamed those women. Of course I did. They've since ascended the TV ladder and work as co-executive producers on major shows. On some level, even today, I can't help but think that could have been me. That should have been me. But those women didn't take our jobs any more than the 50-year-old Hollywood lifers had. Any more than the 50-year-old Hollywood lifers had. The lifers were still there. They're still there. And I'm not angry at the women and people of color who made it instead of me. People have the right, and in most cases, the responsibility to take opportunities that are offered them. Or even at the older white guys who ensured that I didn't. Mostly I'm annoyed at myself. Because instead of settling down, proposing to my then girlfriend, now wife, and earning a steady income that might support a family, I spent a decade insisting the world treat me fairly when the world was loudly telling me it had no intention of doing so. I could see what was happening. I was being told point blank what was happening. And still, I thought I'd be the exception. That if I wrote one more script, took one more meeting, I'd slip through. But very few people get to be the exception. It's strange and more than a little poisonous to see yourself buffeted by forces beyond your control. But there's also comfort in it. Because it's less painful to scroll through other people's IMDb pages late at night, figuring out what shortcut, race, gender, connections they took to successes than to grapple with the fact that there are white men my age who've succeeded and I'm not one of them. I could have worked harder. I could have networked better. I could have been better. And the truth is, I'm not some extraordinary talent who has passed over. I'm an ordinary talent, and in ordinary times, that would have been enough. There's a wounded pride here. How could there not be? I have 2 sons. I used to imagine long before they were born, I would take them to film sets and then I'd bring them along to exotic locations. Instead, their father spends most of his working day in his bedroom scrolling through spreadsheets and ticket listings. What do I say when my boys ask about my old hopes and dreams? What do I tell them when they ask about theirs? All right, so that was The Lost Generation over at Compact Magazine. And what's been fascinating has been the response from some folks who they've tried to deflect, minimize, moralize DEI. And what this article did, it provided the folks who've been saying this for the past decade, us, right? The most scathing, the most comprehensive, the most devastating account documenting exactly how white millennial men were being quietly pushed out of more or less polite society, but also the professional workplace. And it wasn't because of incompetence, right? It wasn't because the market. It wasn't because the white man was failing to adapt to a brand new world, but rather it was because they were explicitly, deliberately, and dare I say, systematically taken out in the name of affirmative action, in the name of DEI. And what was also very eye-opening reading this article is how uncomfortable a lot of the white dudes felt talking about their experience. And it makes sense why they felt uncomfortable, because as white guys, we were trained by society not to talk about our issues. We were told that even noticing this was a moral failure. It was showing your bias. It was showing your privilege. And that right there meant that you deserved what was happening to you. But the truth, and this is something that this article helped bring to the forefront, there's an entire generation of young white men, millennial men, who were shut out of careers simply because they were white and male. Like, not because they didn't work hard, not because they didn't check the right boxes on a resume, but because they checked a box that disqualified them simply from being born a white male. And the most sad, scary, dangerous part of all of this, there was no announcement, right? There was no policy memo. There was no vote, no press conference. It just happened. The doors just stopped opening for white guys. And I've heard folks say that, well, no, this article is just anecdotal. If you actually talk with folks in my generation who lived this. Yes, anecdotal, but start to gather evidence. You're going to see this was more than just a few examples. This was system-wide happening to white guys. There was one guy I saw on Twitter. He shared a story where 1 year after graduation, he was hired for an entry-level role, very well-known New York City museum, and he followed up to submit his hiring paperwork, and then was ghosted. And then 2 weeks later, the person who referred them told them that the boss wanted to hire a person of color instead, and that's why they passed on their friend. I mean, think about that perspective. What does that do to a person? Like, you did everything right. You planned everything right. You did the right steps. You went to school, and then the floor disappears beneath you, not because of what you did or your merit, but just because of your identity, because of who you are. That's just insane. Same guy, telling the same story. A friend referred him to an entry-level job in book publishing, and then HR told their friend that they were only interviewing diverse candidates. Like, that's absolutely racist. That is open discrimination. That is plainly stated, and the outcomes were showing it was working exactly as it was designed. Another story saw over on X. I think it speaks more to not just the short-term pains that a lot of us white guys have experienced, but also the long-term psychological damage. Like, it wasn't just us white guy millennials, right? It was also impacting a lot of Gen Z guys, because they were coming into the workforce, the older Gen Zers, as this was still running rampant. And there was this one Gen Z guy. He was top of his class. He published a full-length sci-fi novel while he was still in school, graduated with a 3.7 GPA, which traditionally is pretty darn good. And then what happened? COVID. And COVID stole his years that he'll never get back. And on top of just the white guy issues, right? Like COVID, he refused the vax. And then, what did that turn into? On top of that, it was years of depression, isolation, and social exile. He kept going, right? He didn't quit. He didn't drop out, and he didn't spiral into nothingness. And what did the system give him? Nothing, right? They gave him no real opportunities. It was more like very basic kind of roles, like doing transcription services, which now is mostly being replaced by AI. Lawn care, right? Crawl space insulation. And it was great work, honest work, but that's not what he invested his time, energy, and effort in pursuing, right? It wasn't what he was told, hey, you do these things and you'll be on the right path to this type of career, right? And what happened was the opposite. Doors didn't open. There's no doors in publishing, no doors in media, no doors in academia. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because he was the wrong type of person. He was the wrong demographic. He was a white dude. And being a white dude at that moment in history wasn't sexy. So eventually, like so many others, he was just like saying, fine, screw it. And what did he do? He did what most of us did. He built something himself. Started a Substack, Kickstarter, podcasts, right? Serialized audiobooks on YouTube. Something no institution would ever fund, and no gatekeeper would ever greenlight, because white man bad. And yet, years of burnout, no mentors, no institutional backing, no safety net, just grind, exhaustion, and constant knowledge that if he fails, there is no plan B. And where is he now at the end of 2025? He makes $10,000 a year, right? For work everyone praises, for work people call important, for work they say is exactly what we need more of, right? That's the sad part. And here's the part that should make you not just sad, but mad. None of this was necessary. Not the depression, not the delay, not the financial uncertainty, not the stalled families, not literally years lost, but instead that support was actually funneled to untalented propagandists, ideological enforcers, right? The people who were openly hostile to our country, but simultaneously were being funded by our country their entire careers. And that rage you hear in his words, that's not an extremist. That's not a white supremacist. That's not radicalization. That's pain. That's pain based on betrayal. And I bet almost every white guy who's at my age, at least, right? They've heard a version of this story or they've experienced it themselves. And not all of these white guys out there that are telling these stories want to be culture warriors, right? I know we do that here in the show quite often, but a lot of you don't want that role. You just want to live your life. And for a lot of you didn't want to go and start building these alternatives, right? You didn't want to go and build a Substack. You didn't want to go and start these alternative media outlets. You just want to live a normal life, follow the normal path. And you wanted careers that actually rewarded effort, meritocracy. And that would lead to families that were built on stability, a future that just made sense, right? That was what we were all kind of promised when we were kids. But then when people ask, like, okay, well, why is YouTube? Why is podcasting? Why are these alternative media organizations, Substack, why are they exploding right now, right? Well, interesting. It happens at the exact same time that we see a just dramatic push towards DEI, huh? It's not mysterious. White men didn't dominate those spaces and didn't help those spaces blow up because of privilege. They fled to them because every institution that was out there was gatekeeping white men away. Academia, media, corporate America, right? Go to the tech space, across the board, and they weren't doing it quietly. They weren't doing it accidentally. They were using explicit quotas in many cases, explicit hiring practices and priorities, explicit HR department instructions. And the most damning part of all of it was who let this happen? Other white men. In this case, older white men, boomer white men, Gen X executives, boomer managers. They didn't resist this. They didn't draw lines in the sand saying, no, this isn't right. They didn't try to protect the next generation of white men workers. They sacrificed white young men workers to preserve their own titles, their own pensions, their own social standings at their organizations. And that's why I've made the boomers a big target, because I watched them cave. I've watched them make deals with ideological extremists just to protect their own asses. I've watched them sell out millennial men, Gen Z men, all so they could keep their beautiful homes, their status, and then they preach, well, pull yourself up by your bootstraps there. Meanwhile, they're enforcing a freeze on hiring young white men, basically across every major institution, and then they openly brag about it. And then if we young white men who are experiencing this firsthand, as it happens, call it out, we're called racists. We're then gaslit. And then we ended up getting the emails from HR. And if we say this is wrong, they say we don't care. This is good. And then everyone acts confused. What? Why? Why are white men angry? Why are white men getting red-pilled? Why doesn't anybody trust our institutions anymore? Oh, I wonder. Let's talk about it. Once hiring becomes focused more on demographics, everything becomes suspect. I don't trust you anymore that you're actually competent for the job. Was my doctor a competent doctor, or are they selected to satisfy some quota, right? My engineer, my pilot. You can't prove that any individual is unqualified, but now you can't also trust the system at all. So that system breeds skepticism. And that skepticism is manufactured, if you think about it. Like, the only reason there is a skeptical approach towards these different roles is because of the policy. But the damage doesn't just stop there at jobs. Think about the other effects, and we're going to kind of go through the first order effects and then thereafter. So men are excluded from careers, right, during their peak marriage years. So what happens? Provider roles, they vanish, right? Now all of a sudden you have the girl boss entering into the workforce. Future stability for men just vanishes. And that leads to second order effects. So now men have no careers. They're disappearing from the dating market now, right? Because women are looking to date up. They're not going to date down to some guy who's making 35, 40K when they're making 80K? No. So what happens? Women are still dating up. So the eligible bachelor pool, right? And you see this on the Manosphere podcasts, like whatever the guy's name, Brian, I think it is. And then the Fresh and Fit podcast where they'll have these women come on the show. And you see a lot of women who are like, yeah, I want a guy who makes mid 6 figures and is over 6 feet tall, or, is in the top 1% financially. And if you were to look at how many people that actually is, the number is like astronomically low. So you're destroying real opportunities for real average men to now get access to average women, because there is a mentality that women now are going to be dating still up. That goes to the third order effects. So now you're going to have fewer marriages, right? And we're seeing this right now. And what it's funny, I was just talking about this last night with my wife. Delayed families, right? So now all of a sudden, instead of you have younger families in their 20s, now you're having families start later in their late 20s, early 30s, mid 30s, or no families at all, right? So what's happening? Fertility starts to decline on both sides. And that leads to fourth order effects. We see a psychological collapse. Men are now suffering from depression, right? Loss of purpose. They start using things like porn to help numb the pain. They start living in worlds like video games and online communities, while simultaneously living in complete isolation themselves in real life. Like, meanwhile, you ask a man, hey, you okay? And they can't verbalize it. They can't even name what was happening to them. Everything was all coming down on them all at once. And they ended up internalizing this as personal failure. This is their fault. This leads to fifth order effects. Institutional trust dies, right? They're not looking at these bureaucracies anymore as arbiters of truth and trying to keep us safe. Now they're the ones promoting propaganda. So that institutional trust dies. We see media credibility collapse because the media was inevitably trying to fluff up and promote what these different institutions were supporting. And then medicine, academia, expert class, they all become suspect. Sixth order effects. Reality becomes unspeakable, because if you notice the pattern and you speak it out loud, you could get fired. So silence is enforced, and that leads to a seventh order effect. The feedback loop accelerates. Men start to talk to other men who are going through the same thing. Resentment will grow. Polarization will deepen, and the system starts to consume itself. Folks, DEI wasn't an accident. DEI was a business model. HR departments have exploded in size over the years. Consulting empires were formed to help promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, in these Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 organizations. Political coalitions were built. Competition was not just eliminated, it was entirely stifled. This didn't just happen. This was entirely by design. It was funded. It was enforced. DEI was a weapon. And the people who built that weapon, the people who enforced it, the people who profited from it, they knew exactly what they were doing. And history should remember them accordingly. All right, folks. With that being said, I hope you get the chance to go back and check out the article yourself. The link will be included here in the show notes. But yes, I did read the entire article in its entirety, yes, from start to finish there. It took an hour to actually get through. But with that being said, thank you for joining us. If you got some value from today's episode, go ahead and give it a share. When you do, tag yours truly at B Nichols Liberty, X, Facebook, and Instagram. Some housekeeping. We are only doing this episode this week because, yes, it is the week of Christmas. So please go enjoy the holidays with your family, with your friends. Please take some time off from work, unplug, and actually tap into what really matters. Family, faith, friends, and of course, football. No, I joke. I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan. They play on Christmas Day, so we'll see what happens. Another loss, I'm assuming, will be on my my Christmas list this year from the Dallas Cowboys. But with that being said, folks, you can find the Brian Nichols Show over on your favorite podcasting platforms and your favorite video platforms. So head to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, or just head over to the good old-fashioned YouTube, Rumble, X, or Facebook. You can find any version of the Brian Nichols Show on any of your favorite platforms. But remember, we have a brand new episode air every Monday, Thursday, and Friday. Obviously, this week it being excluded, but every Monday, Thursday, Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern. So make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit that little notification bell, because I guarantee every episode will leave you educated, enlightened, and informed. And one final ask, folks. If you've gotten some value from the Brian Nichols Show this year and you want to support the show, please go ahead and give us a one-time donation at briannicholsshow.com, or you can go ahead and support our sponsors like Cardio Miracle, Ebel's CBD, Blood of Tyrants Wine, or Liquid Freedom Energy Tea, all phenomenal sponsors here of the Brian Nichols Show. Use code TBNS or scan those little QR codes over my shoulder, or simply head to briannicholsshow.com/sponsors, and you can find all the sponsor links there at the sponsor page, because each link will give you some type of discount, 15% off here, 20% off there, who knows. But with that being said, folks, again, have a very Merry Christmas. Brian Nichols signing off here on The Brian Nichols Show. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to The Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.